Yesterday he had built in 6-minute increments. Now he was sold in 1. The auctioneer's voice reached him as a number before it reached him as language. 49, 49, do I hear a count? And Aaron Vey understood, with the flat certainty of a man reading his own name on the wrong side of a signature block, that the number was him. Lot 49. The dais under his knees was sanded pine, splintered at the lip where other lots had braced and failed, and the grain pressed its catalogue of small cruelties into his shins, while a fresh burn between his shoulder blades announced itself like a clause he had not been allowed to negotiate. The pain had a shape. It was not the wide ache of a bruise, but the precise geometry of a stamp, a rectangle of seared meat the size of a notary's seal, set high on his back where his own hands could never reach to verify the terms. Someone had branded him while he was unconscious. That was the first fact, and he filed it the way he filed everything, by its evidentiary weight. A contract executed against a sleeping party is a contract executed against a party who cannot read it. He could not read it. He could feel it think. The crowd was a wall of wool and lamp smoke, faces tilted up at him with the bored appetite of buyers at a livery sale, and a woman in front held a herring gull's feather to her nose against the stink of the pens, turning it, bored, while a man beside her counted coin into his palm with a wet thumb. Aaron catalogued them. Solvency, cruelty, reach. Old habits, useless now, ran their audit anyway, because the habit was the only furniture left standing in a mind that had gone to sleep in a glass office above a clean grey river and woken inside a stranger's body, hung on a stranger's bones, sentenced to a stranger's debt. His hands were not his hands. Brother Knuckles, a split nail, a callus where a sword or a shovel had argued with the palm and won. This was somebody's working body, poured full of a contract lawyer like wine decanted into the wrong bottle, and the only continuity between the man he had been and the property he now was ran through the one organ that had never stopped working, the part of him that read. So he read. He focused through the burn, the way he had once focused through fatigue at 3 in the morning to find the indemnity buried in a schedule. And the agony narrowed to a point, and then, past the point, opened. Light lifted off his own skin. Not light, text. It hung an inch above the brand, legible from the inside, a pale architecture of letters he was somehow reading from behind, and it resolved into the bones of an instrument he knew in his marrow, a recital, a granting clause, a term. Perpetual servitude, it said, citing chapter and verse he did not recognize. Canon 7, some article, some sub-article, the authority cited with the smug brevity of a body that had never been challenged. Party of the first part, the notorial church. Party of the second part, the bearer, him. The duty ran down the page in a hand so confident it had forgotten to be careful. And carelessness leaves marks. He saw them before he chose to. 3 places where the language went soft, a defined term used before its definition, a clause of duration that leaned on a comma it could not support, a cross-reference pointing at a section the brand did not contain, and each of them lit faintly, as if the document itself were ashamed, highlighted in a yellow only he could see. Ambiguities, the pressure points of any badly drafted thing. He had spent 11 years finding exactly these and charging by the hour for the privilege. The auctioneer's hammer came down. Sold. A weight he could not yet price settled onto the second-party line, and the brand throbbed once, ratified, binding. Aaron Vane knelt on the splintered pine, property now in law and in fact, owned, counted, stamped, and felt, under the searing rectangle of his servitude, the first cold thread of something that was not despair pulled taut across the back of his teeth, because he had just understood the one thing his new owners had not. He could read the brand, and a document a man can read is a document a man can edit. The next lot did not rise. Beside him knelt a man so old the brands had run out of clean skin to take, and Aaron, counting without meaning to, reached 47 before the auctioneer's voice clubbed the air. 47 rectangles stacked rib to nape like a ledger kept too long, some silvered to scar, the newest still weeping a thin amber crust. The old man's spine was a contents page. He held it straight anyway.
Each brand was a paragraph seared into a living body, and the understanding arrived in Aaron not as horror, but as taxonomy, a filing system that breathed.
Lot 50.
The auctioneer slapped the old man's shoulder, the way a clerk slaps a stamp.
Seth, 47 covenants, all current, all clean. He waited out the laugh he had earned. 3 coppers the soul, friends. 3 coppers, and you carry home the whole bound volume. 3 coppers. Aaron did the arithmetic before he could throttle the reflex. 47 souls at 3 coppers apiece, the man priced by his paperwork. The meat worth less than the wax it took to seal him. He had once billed more to read a single indemnity. The market here had only deleted the middleman between the document and the body. Mind your cannon. The auctioneer lifted a rod, and Aaron's gaze snapped to it, with the involuntary focus of a man clocking opposing counsel's pen. A seal rod.
The church writes once, and what the church writes, no hand unwrites. A covenant is holy, a covenant is whole, and the man who alters one serif of it has not breached a contract. He has committed heresy, and heresy is settled in ash. The rod caught the lamp. Nobody breathed wrong. He read what he could have said from the side. The topmost brand cited Canon 12, another Canon 4, each a deed and a verse and a number. The law made legible in scorched skin, so any notary with a rod could audit a man at a glance. The instruments held because they were alive. They thought, the way the rectangle on his own back thought, an inch off the surface, patient. His cited Canon 7. He kept his face from doing anything about it. And the calendar. The auctioneer said it almost gently, the way a man warns you of a loose stare. 30 days to renewal. Every covenant in the province extends itself at the turning, automatic, unless your terms say otherwise, and the church can draw that 30 tight as a noose if it dislikes the look of your throat. A buyer somewhere coughed. So read what you carry. A man who misreads his own brand and acts against the word it actually bears. He drew a dry thumb across his neck. The instrument enforces itself. We sweep up after. The patter rolled on, but Aaron had stopped hearing it as patter. He heard it as drafting. Self-executing penalty. No cure period, no notice provision, no human hand required to pull the trigger, because the clause was the trigger. Misread the term, breach the term, and the term killed you on its own authority, while the church kept its hands clean and its doctrine cleaner. Elegant. He hated how elegant it was. Old Seth turned his head a single degree and read him the way a creditor reads a balance, top to bottom, weighing. You're reading. The words barely cleared his lips. Don't let the rod catch your face doing that. A beat, his eyes flat and dry as old vellum. 47 brands, boy, and I'm still kneeling here breathing. Ask yourself why a man so bound is worth keeping whole. Aaron filed the sentence without answering. A man does not survive 47 enforceable death clauses by accident. Somewhere in that stacked ledger of a back was a paragraph that paid, a seam the church had missed, and the old man had just told him it existed without naming its page. A loophole with a heartbeat. He would want the volume read. The hammer hovered over lot 50. Aaron felt the brand between his shoulder blades pulse in time with the auctioneer's count, certain of its 30 days and all of him. And he understood the full geometry of the trap, the way you understand a contract, every clause of which was drafted by the other side. He could read the instrument and never reach it, edit the law and never survive the edit.
And the calendar that bound him was the same blade that fell the instant he got one word wrong. 30 days. One footnote between him and ash. They moved him at dusk. 2 handlers hauled Lot 49 off the dais by the wrist rope and folded him into a slat-sided cart, already packed with knees, and a silence that had given up arguing, while a buyer he had not yet seen counted coin that rang thin against the auctioneer's tin. He had spent 11 years pricing indemnities. Now he was the line item, carried home in a cart that smelled of tallow, wet wool, and other men's resignation. His spine found the boards. The brand met the wood. It lit. That was the part no one had thought to sell him. Pressure woke the instrument. The rectangle seared between his shoulder blades, pinned flat to a plank that jolted at every rut in the road, began to surrender its terms, the way a struck tuning fork gives up its note. Not the white scream of the iron now, but language, the canon script unspooling behind his eyes, faster than any document had a right to move, each clause handing him the grammar to pass the next. He had construed jargon in a dozen dialects of bad faith. None of them had ever taught him to read itself while he read it. The instrument was tutoring its own captive, whereas it opened, and he understood the word a half-second before he understood how. Recitals. The throat-clearing of every deed ever drafted. The procession of whereas clauses that set the scene and bind precisely no one. Background, not obligation. The part junior associates skim and senior partners weaponize. He read them the go cooper reads the grain before setting iron to the barrel head. Whereas the notarial church, sole and perpetual notary of souls. Whereas Canon 7 ordains the binding of the unredeemed. Whereas the bearer, party of the second part, consents. He stopped. Read it again. Slower. 3 lines into the recitals, where no operative term had any business living, sat a hold harmless. An indemnity. The church indemnified someone against any defect, error, or omission in the instrument. Standard armor, the clause every drafter bolts on so a single typo cannot sink the deal. He had written 1,000 of them. He could draft one drunk, asleep, billing the whole time. This one was broken. The beneficiary slot was filled, and filled wrong. The clause held harmless the party of the second part, him. Some scrivener, copying canon from a master form built to shield the church, had let his hand run down the page and seated the protection in the bearer instead of the holder, indemnified the slave against the very defects meant to kill him. An indemnity aimed at its own target. A gun handed grip first to the man it was bought to shoot. Aaron lay very still and let the cart rock him. A reasonable man would call it nothing. The recitals bind no one. A hold harmless misfiled among the whereas clauses was stage dressing, unenforceable, dead text. He had argued exactly that to break weaker men's contracts, that the operative provisions govern and the recitals merely clear the throat. He had also argued the reverse, when the fee ran the other way, that recitals declare intent, and intent colors every clause downstream. Both arguments lived in the same body of law. Both lived in him, which meant the seam was real. The principle arrived whole, the way a verdict arrives, not as inspiration, but as a finding of fact he could no longer pretend he had not made. The brands were not magic and not gospel. They were documents, drafted by tired hands working from forms. And documents have scenes. A comma where none belongs, an indemnity facing the wrong way, a clause sleeping in the wrong section of the page, and a man who can find the seam can set a thumb in it. He had been reading the wound. He should have been reading the draftsmanship. 47 brands rode in the cart somewhere behind him, stacked up an old man's back. A whole province of them lay beyond the harbor, herring gulls wheeling over a town that ran on sealed skin and never once read its own fine print. The cart hit a rut. The brand pressed the board, and the broken claws flared once, warm, almost grateful. He smiled at the straw. First seam. "You're certain it's clean?"
The woman stood at the cart's tail where the lamp gave out, sleeves cuffed in old ink to the second knuckle, a stamping house on her hands, as plain as any signature. The handler had the slats up. Aaron's spine left the board, and the canon script in his skull went dark mid-clause. A witness that spoke only under the oath of pressure, and fell silent the instant the weight came off the wood. "Clean, sealed, Canon 7 clean," the handler said. "Reads too. You're buying a quill that walks." So that was the trade he had been bound into. The town past the harbor ran on sealed skin. Every debt and dowry and indenture seared into somebody, and somebody had to copy the forms. 11 years he had fed that machine from a glass tower. Now he would feed it on his knees in a copy house for a woman who priced literacy by the knuckle. A notary came forward with the seal rod. The rod was iron, capped in horn, and where it passed, an inch above his shoulder blades, the brand answered, warming, opening its terms to the church's instrument, the way it opened them to him. Except the notary read only the operative skin of it, the surface promise, and never the seam, 3 lines deep in the recitals, where the indemnity sat facing the wrong target. Aaron held still. He let the man find exactly what the form swore, and nothing the form had spoiled. "Warranted fit for all service," the notary intoned, reading the seller's bill. "Affirm your binding, bearer. Speak the scope whole, or the clause speaks it for you." There was the knife. The doctrine was elegant, and it was a snare. The slave authenticated his own sale by reciting the instrument aloud. A true reading let the transfer ratify under the rod, and a false word, overclaim, underclaim, anything the brand could not bear, was heresy. Self-executing, settled in ash with no hand raised. Misread yourself and die. He had once watched a man perjure himself into a cell, one confident sentence at a time. He understood the mechanism intimately. All service was the seller's reading, the greater reading. He ran his own brand again, fast, the script flaring as the rod's pressure woke it. The scope clause did not say all service. It said such service as the instrument shall name, and the instrument, copied from a tired master form, named almost nothing. The broad warranty lived only in the handler's mouth. The skin said less. "Such service as is named herein," Aaron said, flat, the lesser reading. The horn cap warmed, did not flare, and ratified, green gold and indifferent, a stamp coming down on a true thing. The notary's jaw tightened, because he had heard the price drop in real time. A lot warranted for all service was worth more than a lot warranted for the little, its own form troubled to specify, and the woman in the inked cuffs had just acquired a narrower promise than she had been offered, and she knew it, her chin lifting the fraction a buyer's lifts when the goods argue the discount on the seller's behalf. "Less than advertised," she said. "Truer than advertised," Aaron said. "You'll prefer it when the auditor comes." She paid the lesser price. The thing closed with no ceremony grander than a wax disc pressed to a ledger and a thumb laid across his name. Lot 49, struck through, rewritten as hers in a hand that did not shake. He had steered a transaction from inside the merchandise. He had also, he noted with the cold amusement of a man auditing his own cage, just narrowed his bondage by speaking it aloud, which was either the first clause he had ever drafted on his own behalf or merely the longest leash within reach. The distinction would matter later. Tonight, it did not. They walked him up from the harbor, through streets where every shutter and lintel wore its little notarized scar, a whole province that lived by sealed contracts and had never once read its own fine print. A herring gull screamed at the late tide and got no answer. Behind his eyes, the renewal clock kept its own arithmetic, 29 days, the noose still slack, the churches to draw whenever it pleased.
He was the only man alive who could read the seams in their holy paper. He was also the only man those seams could kill. The copyhouse woke before the gulls.
Grey light came late to the long room, and by the time it reached the high window, the place already breathed oak gall and wet stone, and the sour tallow of spent candles. Aaron sat where they had set him, on a stool ground to the shape of better men, a master form pinned flat under lead weights, and a sheet of calf vellum waiting beneath his hand. They called the woman Mistress Orla. She priced literacy by the knuckle. He copied. The work was the gift. Copying meant reading. Reading meant inventory. And a man who has spent 11 years in document review knows the surest way to learn a system is to transcribe 10,000 of its instruments until the patterns surface like grain under a plane. So he wrote out indentures, and dowries, and grain debts, and the long, ugly bonds that mortgaged a man's grandchildren before they drew breath. And behind his eyes he kept a second ledger, the one Orla could not price. First finding: the forms renewed themselves. Every servitude carried a renewal clause near the foot, a small, self-executing engine that struck the term, advanced the date, and re-seared the obligation on a fixed tide unless a counter-instrument intervened. Nobody signed it, nobody witnessed it. The clause simply fired on schedule the way his own would fire in, he checked the arithmetic without wanting to, 26 days. He wrote the clause out 40 times. He learned its serifs the way a locksmith learns a ward. Second finding: brands stacked. He had seen it on the dais, old Seth wearing 47 covenants down his spine like shingles, each later bond seated atop the last, and none erasing what it covered. A body was not a page, then, but a wall, and you could paste fresh paper over old until the man beneath went illegible. Stacking did not cancel. It buried.
Somewhere under the 47th layer, the first contract still ran. And a thing that still ran could still be read. And a thing that could be read, he set that down for later. Third finding: the brands inherited. A debt seared into a father descended to the son by a clause of survivorship, passing down the bloodline like a crooked nose, so that children arrived already party to instruments drafted before their grandmothers were born. The province farmed people the way it farmed barley. Sow a bond, reap 3 generations. Fourth, and the one that cost him sleep, the seal rod. A notary came twice a week to authenticate the fair copies, and Aaron watched the horn cap travel above each sheet and learned its single terrible virtue. The rod did not merely read a covenant, it fixed one, ratifying any alteration beneath it into permanence, so that a clause amended and then sealed was no longer ink a clerk might dispute, but doctrine settled in ash, immutable, unappealable. Edits were possible. He had made one with his own mouth. The rod was the thing that turned an edit from a lie into law. That reframed the board. His yellow seams were live, editable, fallible drafting. But an edit unsealed was only an argument, and an edit sealed was scripture. To change a brand and keep the change, he would need a rod or a notary, or the nerve to become one. The rest he catalogued in the margins of his skull. Which words bound, which merely decorated? The recitals, the whereas clauses, the pious preamble naming the notarial church and canon and the glory of sealed order, carried no teeth. Ornament mistaken for structure by everyone who feared it. The operative clauses bound, and they were few, and they were sloppy. Boilerplate copied by tired hands for centuries, error compounding at interest. 24 days. On the 6th night, Orla set a cracked dish of lamp oil at his elbow and watched him work. Her ink-stained thumbs folded one over the other. "You copy faster than a man should," she said. "And you read the bad ones twice." "The bad ones are worth reading twice," Aaron said, not lifting his eyes.
She studied him the way a buyer studies goods that have begun to argue the discount on her behalf. Then she slid a sealed page across the bench, older than the others, its wax gone the brown of dried blood, and tapped the brand mark scorched into its corner. "Then read this one," she said, "and tell me why it has killed 3 notaries who tried." "You read it like a sentence," Seth said. "It is not a sentence. It is a fence, and the gaps are where the gate was meant to be." He said it without turning, hunched over the drying line in the copyhouse yard, pinning fair copies to the cord with split reeds, while the lamp behind him threw his back into relief. 47 covenants, rib to nape. The same 3 coppers a soul had bought the muscle that hauled Orla's water and the spine that carried, under its shingled scar, the only library in the province no one had thought to burn. They had sold him as a single bound volume. Nobody priced the marginalia. "Show me," Aaron said. So the old man taught him by lamp and by touch, in the half-hour after the notary left and before the curfew bell, while the oak gall ink dried sharp and metallic in the air between them. A comma, Seth said, was not a pause but a hinge. Seat it before the Lord's name and the duty swung free of its holder. Seat it after, and the obligation locked to the man who held the brand like a dog chained inside its own collar. The church taught the marks were holy and fixed. Seth taught that a tired scrivener 3 centuries dead had decided most of them at supper time, hurrying to finish before the light went. And that hurry left doors. "This one," Aaron murmured one night, thumb on a grain debt copy.
The semicolon does the work. "Now you're stealing my supper."
A subordinate clause was the better thief. Tuck provided that such service be lawful into the belly of an operative line. And you had not denied the master his slave. You had merely made the slave's chains contingent on a thing no chain could prove. The trick was to bury the live word where the eye slid past it, the way a tick swells unnoticed on the soft flesh behind a dog's ear, fat and quiet and already feeding. Aaron wrote out 40 such clauses on waste vellum and burned them in the oil dish. No rod sealed them. They were only argument. Argument was practice. The nights compressed. He learned the serifs of the church's house hand until he could date a brand by the slant of its capitals. He learned which canons forbade amendment and which only pretended to, citing penalties that cross-referenced clauses the same scriveners had forgotten to draft. He learned to weigh a shall against a may, the way a cooper sounds a barrel for the cracked stave, tapping, listening, marking the dead note. Seth quizzed him in the dark. Wrong answers cost nothing but the old man's flat silence, which cost a great deal. Then they read the wall. Aaron lay back against Seth's offered shoulder one moonless night and pressed his own brand to the old man's topmost scar. Canon 12, perpetual, clean. And the pressure woke both instruments at once, the way 2 struck tuning forks find each other across a room. Yellow seams bloomed for him alone, an inch off the silvered skin. He read down. Canon 12 governed Canon 4 beneath it. Canon 4 governed 3 more. Each later bond recited the one below as all current, all clean, and not one of them, in 300 years of stacking, had remembered to cancel what it buried. "The first one," Seth said, very low. "You're close to the first one." Aaron's fingers found the oldest layer, the brand at the bottom of the wall, its ink gone the brown of an old wound, and its letters nearly eaten by the scars above. A self-manumission rider, ancient, malformed, alive. The clause that could free the man had been pasted over 46 times by men who never knew it was there, sealed and resealed, witnessed into permanence, and every reseal had carried it forward intact, all current, all clean, the line now load-bearing. He could see, at last, exactly which word governed the soul. One word. A single unless at the head of the rider, dangling, its condition never closed, an open hook waiting 3 centuries for a hand that could read it and a rod that could shut it. "How long have you known?" Aaron said. 40 years. Seth did not move. "I can feel the doors. I have never once been able to read which one opens." His scarred back rose and fell, once. "You moved your own with your mouth on a dais. Boy, I have been waiting for a quill that walks." Meta came at the hour the lard cooled. She wore a debt bond at the wrist, blue-black where the house slaves wore red. Debt being a lesser canon than service, and seared by lesser hands. She rubbed it against the scullery stone without knowing she did it, the way a dog works a burr it can't reach with teeth. 3 coppers had not bought her. A grain debt had. Her father's first, then hers by inheritance, the sum recited down her forearm in a country hand that had run out of skin and crowded its last letters together.
"Orla says you read," she said. "I've nothing to pay you with. Sit. This costs nothing. It hasn't already cost." He turned her wrist to the lamp and pressed his thumb flat to the brand, and the instrument woke under her skin the way his woke when he lay back on his own, surrendering its terms an inch off the flesh, yellow where the language hedged its bets. He read down, "Whereas, and whereas." The debt, the hold, the self-executing renewal that fed on her like a tick, fat behind a dog's ear. The trap sat in one line, drafted at supper time by a man hurrying the light. The bond held her, while the debt stood unpaid. The debt was deemed unpaid until satisfied in coin and in labor. Both. Coin she would never touch. Labor she had given for 9 years, scouring copper and hauling ash. Every hour of it billed straight back as board, so the ledger never once moved. The "and" was the chain. Not the seal, not the canon. A conjunction, copied 40 times by men who never read what they sealed. He had burned 40 such clauses in the oil dish, never on a person, never where it would take and could not be unsaid. "It's ambiguous," he told her, though she could not have cared less how. The house hand wrote, and as a single hooked stroke, a tired scrivener would not trouble to set apart from the mark for "or." Both readings had been sealed, blessed, witnessed into her wrist 40 times, without one notary ever choosing between them. An ambiguous instrument must be construed. By every law these people held holy, he was entitled to construe it. He pressed harder and spoke the true reading aloud, the way he had narrowed his own bondage on the dais with a rod listening, satisfied in coin or in labor. The brand did not break. Nothing tore. Nothing bled. The surface of the seal kept its perfect notarized skin, smug and intact.
The yellow seam where the conjunction had hedged drew shut. The ink beneath it cooled from the live brown of an open wound to the flat black of a thing that has finished arguing, and the debt, deemed paid, the instant labor alone could pay it, paid 9 years over, ceased to subsist. The bond had nothing left to grip. It went quiet. Meta gasped and seized her own wrist. "It stopped," she said. She pressed it again, hunting the low, constant pull she had carried so long she'd stopped naming it. The hum every bound soul wore like the ache of an old brake before rain. Gone. Her face did the arithmetic her mouth could not reach. "There's nothing there. It doesn't pull." "You don't owe anything. You never owed labor and coin both. A man wrote, and where his form meant "or," and 40 notaries sealed his hurry without reading it." He lifted his thumb away. "I only read it back the way it was always entitled to be read. They can't unseal that." "Not without a rot, and no rot is coming to argue a kitchen girl back into a chain that was never lawful." The seal held. That was the whole of it, and the largest thing he had yet understood. He had not forged, not broken, not added a single stroke. He had set his thumb in a seam the church itself had sealed shut, and the seam had given. On vellum it had been argument, on her flesh it took. Seth stood in the doorway without sound. 47 covenants banked against the dark. On a person, the old man said, not a question. On a person. Aaron looked at the dead black mark, then at the wall of brands at the door, then at his own hands, which had stopped shaking some while ago, without asking him. One conjunction, one girl. The next thing arrived cold and complete, the way a verdict arrives before its words. This was not a talent, it was a procedure, and a procedure could be taught. 200 miles south, the ledger fell out of true. It was not a book.
It was one sealed sheet the length of a refectory table, kept in the diocesan counting hall under glass, and every bond struck in the province wrote itself there in a thread of the same live brown that ran beneath the skin of the branded, each entry pulling at its neighbors, so the whole sheet stayed taut as warp on a loom. The auditors did not read it, they felt it. Palms flat to the vellum, they took the tension the way a miller knows his stones run dry, a breath before the sound changes. Brother Haldane felt the slack at the hour the lamps were trimmed. One thread had gone loose among 10,000 drawn tight, and when he walked his fingers down the column to find it, he came to rest on a grain debt, inherited, recited in a crowded country hand, paid. That was not the trouble. Debts were paid daily. The trouble was the manner. The entry showed satisfied, and nothing stood behind it, no ratifying burr, no countermark, no notary's fee. The furrow turned, and no plough anywhere in the field. A covenant moved only when a rod moved it. This one had moved itself, and it had moved toward mercy. He logged it as a copyist's slip, and slept badly. By morning it had a second feature he liked less. The thread had not snapped, it had been construed. The conjunction in its recital resolved quietly to the lesser reading, and sealed by no hand at all. Haldane had audited 30 years, and kept a name for every defect in the long canon of defects. For this he had none. He sent for the man who collected the ones without names. Calder came on the third day, on foot, carrying a rod and no retinue. He read the slack thread once, the way a physician takes a pulse he already expects to stop. And then he did the thing the auditors had never seen done to the great sheet. He disagreed with it. He laid the rod flat across the paid entry and bore down. Green gold woke under the iron. Ratify. And the thread should have firmed to his authority, accepted the correction, gone back to obedient brown. It held its reading against him. The mercy stayed sealed. Calder lifted the rod and watched the cold light die on its tip, regarding the instrument as a man regards a tool that has failed him once, and is therefore no longer only a tool. "Someone has read against the seal," he said, "and the seal has taken the reader's part." He entered the finding at noon in the voice men use for things going into a permanent record. Not forgery. Forgery he could burn and forget. Forgery copied the divine hand and was merely a lie. This was worse and cleaner. Some reader in the province had stood beside the hand that authored the covenants and presumed to choose among its words. And what could be chosen once could be chosen again. And a province of bound souls who learned their chains were only sentences, badly drafted, sealed by tired men, would stop kneeling to the rod and start reading. Heresy. He wrote the word, and the word was a door. The writ he opened was itself an instrument, a Hunt covenant citing Canon 7 and the immutability articles, binding every notary in 3 dioceses to surrender the heretic on sight, sworn into his own forearm so it could not be mislaid or sold. He set his thumb to the slack thread a final time and followed its pull north, up the trade road, past the salt fens, to a copy house where a province's sealed forms were kept by an ink-stained mistress and a quill that walked. North of him, in that house, Aaron drew his second ledger out of memory by lamplight and began to teach it. He showed Seth the seam first. where a conjunction hooked, where an indemnity faced the wrong party, where a renewal fed on a verb it was never granted. 47 covenants on the old man's hide, and 3 of them with mercy already sleeping in the grammar, waiting. Meta stood at the door with a knife she did not need. The method had a shape now. It could be written down. It could be carried in more heads than one, which is the only form of fact a church cannot burn. The yard dog began to bark at nothing on the south road. Then it stopped. A copyist named Wren had never been asked what a clause meant. She had reproduced 10,000 of them. Dowry bonds, indentures, the perpetual service forms with their 3 nested provisos. Every serif true to the exemplar, and not once had she known which word in a line was the one that held a person to the floor. That was the design. The church bred scribes the way a granary breeds weevils, a tolerable loss, kept too fine to organize.
Aaron laid a reed before her and set the rushlight at her elbow. Find me the verb that does the work. She found it on the 4th pass. Her fingers stopped under bind, and her face did the thing he had learned to wait for. The small slackening of someone who has just understood that the door was never locked, only painted to resemble wall. The estate network ran on hands like hers, 1 or 2 to a great house, lent and borrowed at planting and at burial. And because a borrowed copyist carried no rank, she could move where no steward dared, through kitchen yards and grain carts, and into a dying man's room to take his last codicil, which meant the method could ride the same roads the bondage did. He mapped them as he had once mapped a counterparty's signatories, who copied for whom, who owed whom an exemplar, where the verb slept, and which sleepers had a comma close enough to wake. He did not teach them to edit, not yet.
An unsealed edit was only an argument. He had said this to Seth, and he said it now to every pen he gathered, drawing the line between an argument and scripture in the same flat tone, because a hand that learned to read against the rod before it understood that reading alone changed nothing would get itself burned for a feeling. So he taught reading first. Sedition enough. A copyist who could find the verb could find the comma, and one who could find the comma could see the hinge. Seated before the Lord's name, the duty swung free. Seated after it, the duty locked to the bearer. And a hand that had seen one hinge could not afterward unsee them. And a province of unseeing hands was the only floor the rod had ever stood on. He drilled them in the loft above the coopers by a single rush soaked in mutton fat that fouled the air and everything copied under it. The curriculum he laid out like a man arranging tools he meant to be buried with.
First, data brand by the slant of its capitals, the upright strokes old, the leaning ones, the tired fashion of notaries working a quota at dusk. Second, separate the canon that truly forbade amendment from the one that only postured, the false one citing penalties that cross-referenced clauses no hand had ever drafted, threats hung on empty pegs. Third, he stopped before third every night. Third was the rod, and they had none. Seth sat the back of the loft like a ledger no one could close, 47 covenants stacked on his hide, 3 with mercy already sleeping in the grammar. He said little and let his sleeve fall open when a pupil doubted that a chain could be a sentence badly built. The oldest layer he kept covered. The dangling, unless, at the floor of his wall, was not a teaching aid. It was a lock waiting on a key Aaron did not have, and he would not show a room of new readers a door he could not yet open, because hope drafted carelessly killed faster than despair.
Meta taught the grain forms. She had been the first satisfied bond, and she stood at the board reciting the hooked stroke that read either, and, or, making each apprentice say both aloud until the ambiguity stopped frightening them and started looking like a tool. 1 became 3, 3 became 9. 9 was a fact too widely held to gather and burn, which was the only kind of fact he trusted. On the 9th night, a 10th came up the ladder. She was a kitchen-borrowed copyist from a salt fen house, quick-fingered, eager,
and she took the offered exemplar and wrote her name to be entered among them. Aaron read her forearm out of habit before he read her hand. The brand there was new.
The capitals stood dead upright, the ink still glossy enough to catch the rushlight, and the clause beneath them was not a service bond at all, but a surrender. Every notary in 3 dioceses sworn to give the heretic up on sight. The same words Calder had burned into his own arm. Copied down into hers, without her knowing, she now carried the hunt inside the schoolroom. She smiled and asked which word did the work. He gave her the verb and nothing after. The rule that had kept them all breathing changed that night, because a brand that climbs a ladder smiling is still a brand, and will carry home whatever it is shown. And the only defense against a memorized room was to ensure the room held nothing a single memory could convict. He resolved that nothing built in the loft would again be a thing his own mouth alone could finish. A trick dies with its hand. Procedure does not.
So he assembled the cleaning the way he had once stacked a closing binder. Tabbed, dull, indexed against the day a hostile party read every page aloud, hunting the seam. Intake first. A body came through the cooper's yard after dark, threading the stacked staves and the smell of green oak, and a copyist, Wren, steady now in her 9th week, read the forearm by the one rush and wrote down only what the ink admitted. Party, term, the working verb, the nearest comma, the slant of the capitals that dated the notary's tired dusk hand. No names. The book held instruments, not people. Drafting next. They built the argument and then tried to break it, one pupil playing the bored auditor who wanted only to go home, hunting the false canon, the penalty that cross-referenced a clause no hand had ever drafted. The threat hung on an empty peg. Because a freedom that could not survive a hostile reading was not a freedom, but a confession written slow. If the mock auditor cracked it, back it went.
Nothing left the loft, Huff argued. Ratification was his alone, and he hated that it was. He spoke the construction and the bond let go. No rod, no notary. Only the reading the seal had somehow agreed to answer. And each time the surrender came, he felt the same dry vertigo, the seal turning to him like a dog that had changed masters and not yet been told. One reader who could close. A faction with one rod is a faction with one neck. He wrote the liability into the ledger behind his eyes and underlined it twice. Then concealment, which was the whole doctrine and the reason the rest existed. Every freedom had to survive an audit. He had learned the hard edge of this from a thread 200 miles south he would never see. A bond, once retired, went slack on the great ledger no matter how lawfully it died, and a slack thread would be felt by some finger trained to feel it. The work was not to hide the slackness. The work was to make sure that when the finger followed the slack to its end, it found a clean knot and not a wound. A debt deemed satisfied by labor 9 years over. A service bond, read down to its buried, provided that such service be lawful and the condition shown unmet, the chain voided by its own grammar rather than cut against the grain. People paid debts. People died. Threads went slack for lawful reasons every hour of every day, and a freedom dressed as ordinary attrition was a freedom no auditor could indict, because the indictment would have to call the canon itself a liar. They retired 4 that month. A netmaker whose bond hinged on a comma, a drunk notary, had seated one fatal space before the Lord's name. A widow, 2 brothers signed by their father into a grain debt with the same hooked stroke meta drilled at the board, and Aaron read it, and the loft watched 2 men learn at once that the wall had always been a painted door. The practice grew the way rot grows in a beam, inward, quiet, load-bearing before anyone thinks to check. Copyists carried the method down the borrowed pen roads, folded into ordinary exemplars. A marginal note here, a way of reading there, so the knowledge bred faster than any rod could ride. Seth sat in the back and let his sleeve fall open for the doubters, and kept his oldest layer covered. Meta taught the ambiguous and,
Wren learned to date a capital at a glance. He should have been pleased. The method worked. The audits, when he imagined them, came back clean. He looked across the loft to where the salt fen copyist bent over her exemplar, the upright capitals on her forearm catching the rushlight, fresh ink, a notary's dead-level hand. Every freedom must survive an audit. He had built the entire doctrine for a distant finger on a distant thread, and had not once planned for the audit to climb his ladder, sit among his pupils, and ask politely which word did the work. Garan came on a market Tuesday. He smelled of the tannery. Hands stained the brown of old blood that would not wash past the wrist. And he carried his bond, folded so many times, the crease had worn the ink to a ghost exactly where it mattered. A field service indenture. 20 years run. The working verb, clean. The term discharged with 2 seasons to spare. Wren read it down and flagged nothing, and the math was honest in the way that math is rarely honest. Tolle played the auditor. The boy took the role the way he took everything, too hard, asking the rude question twice, and then a third time to watch the answer sweat. He found the penalty clause folded against the spine, forfeiture upon breach, the standard teeth, and marked it dormant, because a term fully satisfied cannot be breached, and a dead clause cannot bite. He marked it dormant. That was the error, and it wore the face of a fact. The penalty did not hang on breach the way a man hangs on a rope. It hung on a cross-reference. No obligation extinguished save by the article that blessed lawful completion. And that article pointed to a section the copyist's exemplar did not contain. A number with nothing behind it. The empty peg. They had been drilled to find empty pegs and read them as bluff, because a threat that cites nothing usually threatens nothing. Usually. The seal did not need the missing words to fire. It needed only the gap where the blessing should have stood. And Garen's lawful completion, construed aloud, became in the seal's flat arithmetic a termination without sanction, a breach. Aaron spoke the release. The bond let go. For one breath the man was free, and his face did the thing free faces do, loosening at the jaw like a fist opening after a long grip. Then the brand on his forearm darkened from rust to char. It ran through meat the way the great ledger ran slack across stone. Garen's knees found the boards. His pulse, when Aaron's thumb went to the wrist, out of a habit older than this borrowed body, climbed and stuttered and quit, and the ink crawled the cascade clause to clause, each forfeiture springing the next, the whole instrument foreclosing on the only collateral a man without property ever posts. It took less time than the reading had taken. The loft went the specific quiet of people not breathing. Meta's chalk stopped against the board. Seth's sleeve, for once, stayed shut over the oldest layer. Aaron did not kneel long. He read the arm. He read it the way he should have read the copy. Every cross-reference walked to its end with the dull patience he charged by the hour in another life. And there it was. The live trap dressed as a dead one. The seam Toller's pencil had crossed and his own eye had blessed. The mock auditor had asked the right question. They had simply preferred the comfortable answer. And comfort, he saw now, was the one thing the procedure could not afford to keep in the room. He stood with the dead man's bond in his hand and understood the doctrine he had been too proud to draft. A freedom built careless does not fail safe. It is an execution with a longer fuse and better manners. The seal splits no difference. It does not hand a man back into bondage when his release goes wrong, because the seal knows only completion or breach, and breach in these old field covenants carried one penalty, always, paid in the single currency the brand can always collect. He had built the clinic to survive a distant finger on a distant thread. He had not built it to survive his own clean hand. He opened the ledger that held instruments and not people, and broke his own rule. He wrote a name. Garen, Tanner, freed and killed by one sentence in one breath. The verb correct.
The citation fatal.
Then he ruled a new column down the right of every freedom retired and yet to come, narrow, plain, and set at its head the only word the work had earned: surviving. He underlined it once. Beneath it he entered a number, and the number was 4, where an hour ago it had been 5, and the missing one would not be carried forward, because the dead do not survive an audit. They only stop being a problem the canon can name. "You drew the trap before I could name it," Seth said, and the old man's deference landed wrong in Aaron's ear, because a week ago the teaching had run the other way down this same table. Aaron did not accept the gift. He laid the dead man's bond beside a blank vellum and began to build the thing he should have built first, not a freedom, but a form for freedoms, a standard instrument that any of the 9 could fill the way a clerk fills a writ of attachment, each blank load-bearing, each line crosswalked to its own end before the verb was ever spoken aloud. Tabs. 2 checklists. A column for empty pegs, and the rule that no peg was bluff until walked to its silence and back. Seth's thumb pressed the new draft flat. His knuckles were the color of tallow under the lamp, and they did not shake, which was its own kind of statement from a man who had spent 40 years not signing things. "Make it dull," Aaron said. "Dull survives a hostile reading." They worked the form like a counterparty's contract, turned on the maker. Every clause that helped a freedman, Aaron drafted twice. Once to win, once to break. And where Tolly, playing auditor again, could not break it, they let it stand. Where he could, they buried a footnote that closed the seam, numbered against the section that held it. The number behind the number actually present. No undrafted threats. No verbs sleeping where the seal could wake them. The trick that killed Garen would not write this form, because a trick dies with its hand and a procedure does not. And Aaron meant this procedure to outlive his hands by a generation. Then Ren came up the ladder 2 rungs at a time, with salt in her hair and the wrong news. "They moved the renewal," she said. "Spring quarter. The criers had it at the fen gate this morning." Aaron set the pen down with a care that cost him. The renewal was the diocesan re-blessing, the rite that walked every standing brand through the seal again and stamped the blessing article fresh into instruments worn thin by years and weather. The very article Garen's copy had lacked. Move it early, and every dangling peg in 3 dioceses would be filled at once, every empty cross-reference answered, every soft seam in the old field covenants drawn tight and made to bite. Calder was not hunting the slack anymore. He was salting the ground the slack ran through, closing the loopholes wholesale before a reader could reach them, and a window measured in seasons collapsed to a window measured in weeks. "He's amending faster than we can read," Seth said. "He's amending everything." Aaron heard the size of it arrive. 1 brand at a time, Ren found the working verb on her 4th pass. 9 readers, 4 freedoms a month, and against that the church could re-bless a whole province between 2 market days. Arithmetic he could not win. The clinic was a needle. They were bringing the flood. He stood. He walked to Seth's wall and put his palm flat on the stacked layers where the oldest self-manumission rider slept under its dangling unless, and the cold of the deepest leaf came up through the newer skins like a draft under a door. A needle against a flood. Wrong tool. He turned the question over the way he turned a counterparty signature block. Not who signs, but who is bound to the signer. Not the brand, but the instrument the brand copies from. Every servile mark in the province descended from an exemplar. The copyists worked from masters, the masters from a diocesan original, the original from one seminal grant filed at the source, the verb every later verb only quoted. He had been reading the quotations. He had never once asked to read the thing being quoted. The map redrew itself in his skull, the estate network of borrowed copyists he charted, by who owed whom an exemplar suddenly legible as a single tree with a single trunk, and the renewal, by gathering every leaf back to the seal at once,
would carry them all past one route. "We stop counting heads," he said. Seth looked up. Wren went still with the salt still drying on her. "One by one we lose, always. They can re-bless faster than we can read, and they will."
He spread the dead man's bond and the new dull form side by side, two scales of the same cruelty, and laid his finger not on either, but on the empty air between them, where the source belonged. "So we don't free a man. We don't free 9. We go to the exemplar every brand in the jurisdiction is copied from, and we amend the original, once, and let the copies inherit." The revelation sat down in the room like a creditor. Free the document, and you free everyone it ever wrote. The charter came up the coast as a rubbing, wax pressed cold over the diocesan founding stone, then peeled, the relief of its letters standing tallow grey where a quarryman's chisel had cut them 2 centuries back. Wren had bought it off a stonemason's apprentice for a week of salt wages, and carried it flat against her spine so the swells would not crack it, and now it lay on Seth's bench under 4 lamps, the master every brand in the province had only ever quoted. Aaron read it like a parent agreement, slowly. Twice. Every servile mark in the jurisdiction incorporated this by reference, whether the branded knew it or not, the way a clerk initials a schedule he has never once turned to. And here was the schedule itself, the operative grant, the verb from which all the loft's small verbs descended as copies of a copy. He found the renewal clause on the 3rd pass. It sat near the foot, dull as a drainage easement, and dull was exactly where they hid the live wires. The clause did what the criers had promised. At each renewal, the seal walked every standing brand through the founding stone's blessing, stamped the article fresh, cured the worn, filled the empty peg, drew thin old field covenants tight enough to bite. Calder had moved only the date. The machine was the charter's own, 200 years indifferent, and he had handed Aaron the press, believing he was bolting the door. "He thinks he is closing us out," Aaron said. Seth wet his thumb and held it over the wax without touching, the way you test a kiln. Aaron set the comma first. It went between the renewing and the named obligation. A hairline, nothing. The width of a gull's quill laid flat. And it turned an act of confirmation into a clause left hanging on a condition not yet shown. The footnote came after, numbered to a section 3 references back, so that any finger walking the index would land on innocuous boundary language and not on the thing it actually held. And the footnote supplied the condition in the charter's own register, provided that such service be found lawful at the hour of its blessing. Lawfulness walked peg to peg until it required a blessing article, the founding grant, drafted before that article had ever been coined, did not and could not contain. So the renewal would reach in to stamp the article fresh. It would find the charter demanding the article be already present at the moment of blessing. A thing impossible. The seal, reading completion against a condition it could not satisfy, would void the whole of perpetual service the way it had voided Garin. Except this time, the gap was drawn on purpose, and the instrument it broke was not a man, but the master they were all copied from. Free the document. Free everyone it wrote. "Read it against me," Aaron said, and slid Toll the wax. Toll took the auditor's voice, flat, hostile, hunting the seam, the way Calder's clerks would read it on the day they came, and he read every line aloud, as if for a tribunal. The comma, the boundary clause, the footnote behind the footnote, and where the language flexed, he leaned. And where he leaned, Aaron had already buried the closing reference, so the seam shut under pressure instead of splitting. Twice Toll stopped. Twice he found nothing a canon court could name. The amendment did not argue. It did not free anyone in words a hostile reading could indict. It merely let the Church's own right arrive at the Church's own conclusion. And an indictment would have to stand up and call the canon a liar to its face.
That was the whole craft of concealment, dressed for the largest stage they had. Make the freedom look like attrition. Make the void read as the founder's intent, the comma a thing some long-dead diocesan scribe might plausibly have set, the footnote a clarification any pious clerk would have welcomed. When they were done, the page looked less like a wound than like something the church had always meant to say and only now remembered. Seth sat back. His knuckles, tallow pale, lay still on the bench. "It will hold for 100 brands. For every brand," Aaron said. "Once." The word landed where it always landed. One ratification. He's alone. No second rot in 3 dioceses. The seal turning to him at the end, like a creature waiting to be told whose hand it answered now. And a faction with 1 rod was a faction with 1 neck, and he had underlined that liability twice in a ledger no one else could read. He folded the wax into oilcloth. The press existed. He still had to reach the stone. "You want the seal stone," Holt said, "the way a drowning man wants the river." The magistrate had been the easiest to read and the hardest to like, which is the usual order. Aaron set 3 things on the table between them: a receipt for a bribe Holt had taken from a grain factor 2 winters back, a copy of the judgment that bribe had bought, and a blank sheet. He let the blank sheet sit longest. Holt's eyes kept returning to it the way a tongue returns to a cracked tooth. And that was the leverage. Not the receipt, which only proved a crime, but the empty page, which promised one not yet written, and therefore worse.
A man fears the indictment he cannot yet read.
"I want an evening," Aaron said. "The stone unguarded for the duration of 1 rite. You will be elsewhere, witnessed, drunk if you can manage it convincingly." "And the receipt?" "Burns when the stone is amended, not before." Holt weighed it like a coroner weighing an organ. Self-interest is clean to negotiate. It has no second clause. He named his night, the renewal vigil, when the seal house keeper went to the long mass and left the bronze door to a single underdeacon with a fondness for plum brandy. Aaron wrote nothing down. He folded the bargain into the same mental ledger where he kept his own neck, underlined once, provisional. Iselle was the dangerous one. She came to the clinic after dark, a notary still in good standing, ink under the same nail he'd watched her chew flat with worry, and she did not sit. A notary seal is a small authority and a large appetite for sleep. She had lost the second, keeping the first.
"If I notarize the amendments transit," she said, "I am the hand the court traces back, not you, me." True. He did not insult her by softening it. "You witnessed Garen's brand," Aaron said instead. Her jaw moved. She had. She had stamped the tanner's bill of service 11 years ago. A girl then, proud of the press in her fist. And she had watched the same press refuse him 11 years later, when the gap fired and the man went down between one breath and the next, with the ink still arguing in his skin. Conscience is a slower currency than fear, and it pays in full. He let her stand in the silence and assemble her own argument. The best persuasion is the kind the other party believes they wrote. "Lawful at the hour of its blessing," she said at last, reading the footnote off the wax he slid her, mouthing it the way Seth tested a kiln. "You're not freeing them. You're making the church admit it never owned them." "The church will admit nothing. The right will." She took the oilcloth packet. Her hands did not shake, which told him more than shaking would have. The freed were the coalition's spine, and its weakest joint at once. Meta the grain debtor, who could move through the market wards no deacon searched. The netmaker, whose knots no one questioned on the seawall below the seal house. The 2 brothers, useful for a wall that needed climbing and a watch that needed keeping. The widow, who washed altar linen and so held a key to the very threshold. Aaron did not lead them by speech. He gave each a single, verifiable task, no 2 tasks touching,
so that a finger walking from any one of them found a clean knot, and not the shape of the hole. Concealment built into the cell itself. The doctrine extended from parchment to people. Meta asked the question he'd been waiting for. Who ratifies it? When it's on the stone, whose word makes it stick? The room turned to him the way the seal always turned to him. Mine, Aaron said.
One rod in 3 dioceses, one neck. He heard the dry vertigo arrive on schedule, the floor tilting half a degree, the old conviction that a faction resting its whole weight on a single ratifying hand was a faction with a noose pre-tied to its own measure. And he had no second hand to offer, no apprentice yet drilled deep enough to take the seal if his throat were opened on the seal house steps. He logged it, underlined twice, said none of it aloud. The netmaker spoke into the quiet, plainly. Then we keep you breathing till it's done. Till it's done, Aaron agreed, and that was the coalition, such as it was. A bought magistrate, a guilty notary, 4 freed souls, and 1 lawyer who could not be replaced and knew it. He rolled the wax tight. Then the underdeacon, who liked plum brandy, knocked at the clinic door, sober, and asked which of them was lot 49. The underdeacon answered his own question. He laid a square of tanned hide on the intake table, its edges curling like a leaf left too near the kiln, and the lamp found what had been pressed into it. Not script, but rubbings, soot and tallow lifts of brands taken off a living arm, 47 of them numbered down the margin in a clerk's patient hand. Aaron knew the 7th by its broken serif. He had read it once across a kiln mouth, while the man wearing it taught him where a comma could be made to hide. Sef. 47 owners stacked on one forearm, the whole resume of a body sold and sold and sold again. Deacon Auditor Calder sends his compliments to the reader, the underdeacon recited, sober as the bronze he guarded. He holds the kiln man. He will not mark him further. He asks only that the province attend. Attend what? A re-ratification. Public. The old man's arm read aloud. Every grant re-blessed. Every article the founders left to chance, now supplied in full. Aaron held still and let the clause finish unfolding in front of him. He saw the architecture before the threat in it. Calder had stopped hunting the reader and started patching the law. A re-ratification performed correctly, each grant reissued with the blessing article complete, no orphaned duty, no empty peg, would close the very gaps Aaron lived inside. And worse, performed on the founding stone during the renewal, it would write the missing article into the master grant itself, the one his amendment depended on lacking. His comma needed the old stone to stay ignorant. Calder meant to educate it. One ceremony, 47 arms read clean, and the province's servitude would no longer be a flawed instrument with seams to work. It would be a sealed one, perpetual, audited shut. The man had learned. That was the unkind part. When, Aaron said, the vigil. The underdeacon's hands were steady, which told him the brandy was a genuine casualty and not a ruse. He says the reader will understand the elegance of the hour. He did. The same unguarded evening Holt had sold him, the same long mass that emptied the seal house. Calder had bought the calendar Aaron was robbing and meant to hold his own right on it, in the open, with the kiln man's arm as the primary exhibit and a congregation as the notary. Aaron's coalition was built to move through a sleeping town. It was not built to walk into a lit one. He laid 2 fingers on the 7th rubbing. The choice arrived already itemized, the way the worst ones did. Go for Seth, and he spent the cell. Met in the wards, the netmaker on the seawall, the widow with her altar key. On a rescue that announced the whole shape a single walking finger could then trace. The amendment would survive in the oilcloth, but the hands meant to carry it would be in cells of a different kind. Leave Seth, and the ceremony proceeded. The old grant learned its missing word,
The founding stone closed. 47 brands re-blessed before witnesses became the precedent that buried every freedom yet to be filed, including the form he'd drafted twice and the column down the right margin that still had room for names. Save the man, lose the instrument. Save the instrument, lose the man who had taught him to read it. The seal split no difference. Neither, apparently, did Calder. Aaron found himself doing the obscene thing his mind always did under load: drafting. If the re-ratification supplied the article aloud, then the article spoken was itself an instrument, witnessed, dated, blessed. And an instrument could be read. And a thing read could be construed against the reader's intent if the reader were standing close enough to hear which word exactly Calder chose. There was a version where he did not have to choose.
There was a version where the ceremony built to wall him out became the press that fired his amendment for him. 47 arms and a congregation supplying the blessing article he needed the stone to hear. Thin, untested. The kind of peg he'd ruled no man could call bluff until it was walked to its silence and back. He had until the vigil to walk it. "Tell the deacon auditor the reader is flattered," Aaron said, "and will consider the invitation." The underdeacon nodded, took up the rubbing, took Seph's arm back off the table and rolled it like a writ, and left the door open behind him on purpose. Aaron sat with the empty square of lamplight where the hide had been. Then he reached for the oilcloth, unrolled the amendment he had drafted to break the stone, and began, beneath the buried footnote, to draft a second one. Because somewhere in the next paragraph, written small enough to survive, was the sentence that would either save the kill man or finish him, and he could not yet tell which it was. The lamp guttered, and he did not trim it. For an hour he had read the thing as two doors. Save the man, lose the instrument. Save the instrument, lose the man. Because that was the shape it had been handed to him in, and a binary was only an exhibit list that someone else had closed. The man who drafts the document controls the doors. Calder had drafted this one. So Aaron stopped reading the doors and started reading the room they opened onto, which was the same room he had wanted all along. The founding stone, on the vigil, with a right standing over it prepared to supply every article aloud. He had a press without a stone. Calder was about to deliver the stone. The recognition came the way a missing word does on a third pass, dull, then live. His master amendment needed one ratification at the founding stone, and one only, an affirmative edit waiting on a hand he did not possess. Calder had hired the hand. 47 arms read clean. A congregation made notary by mere attendance. The blessing article pronounced over the master grant in the founder's own register. Calder would perform, with full pomp and a borrowed choir, the precise ratifying act the comma had been drafted to wait for. The right would supply the article. The article would arrive at a grant that could not contain it, and the grant, completing against the condition shown false in the same breath, would void the whole of perpetual service while the deacon's hand was still raised in blessing. He would not have to break the stone. He would let Calder stamp it shut on Aaron's edit and call the sound a seal. One peg remained, and he walked it twice before he trusted his own weight on it. The hide read on the vigil had to be his version, not Calder's. The founding rubbing carrying the hairline comma. The footnote buried 3 references back. The condition phrased in a register a reader's eye would skate across like meltwater on slate. Substitution then, not theft, not theatre, but one sheet of oiled hide exchanged for another on a lectern in a lit nave, performed near enough to the reading that no index-walking finger found the seam before the words were spoken, witnessed, and, by the Church's own doctrine, made binding the instant they were blessed. He unrolled the rest of the coalition across the table like a docket and reassigned every line. Holt's Sealhouse Vigil was no longer a way out of a sleeping town.
It was the empty house that left the founding stone unguarded by anyone who could read.
Izel's transit notarizing became cover for a sheet that had to enter the nave clean and leave it changed. The widow's altar key, drafted weeks ago for a door no one would now bother to open, fit the sacristy where the lectern hides were kept dry against the salt. Meta in the wards, the netmaker on the seawall, each non-touching task he had spread thin to keep them deniable, he now drew to a single point and a single hour, knowing the arithmetic of it. Spent here, the cell could not be spent twice. One move, no second filing. Seth sat inside the same paragraph, which was the part he had refused to let himself want. The keelman's arm was Calder's primary exhibit. Read aloud, every article supplied, that brand would be re-blessed into permanence before the stone ever learned its lesson. Unless the Second Amendment, the small one drafted under the buried footnote, reached the lectern in the same hand as the first, so that the article spoken over the master grant discharged Seth's particular service as a condition of its own completion. Save the man by the act that broke the instrument, same comma, same hour. He could not yet swear the line would hold under a spoken reading, and a spoken reading was self-executing on the misreader, which meant the test and the verdict would land in the same instant on whoever's tongue carried it. He pressed the comma flat with his thumb, no wider than a herring gull's quill laid down, and the wet ink held without smudging. 3 days to the vigil. He folded both amendments into the oilcloth, tied it with the netmaker's tarred twine because his own hands had begun the smallest tremor, and the knot did not care, and rose to go wake halt with the worst sentence in his trade. We are not going around the ceremony, we are going through it, and whoever carries this sheet to that lectern carries the only copy of a law no one has ever read aloud and lived. The bell rang once and did not repeat. By the time the second hour of the vigil thinned the candles, the nave held the whole province in paper. Every covenant in 3 dioceses had been carried in, rolled and tagged, stacked along the chancel rail in baskets of oiled rush until the place smelled less of tallow than of cured hide and the iron of old ink. The founding stone lay uncovered on a trestle at the crossing, smaller than the rumor of it, a slab the grey of a herring gull's back, with the charter cut shallow across its face. A man who had been Lot 49 8 months ago stood 4 paces from it in a borrowed grey scribe's coat, and no one in the room thought that strange. They had asked for a clean hand. He had the cleanest in the harbour. Halt was not here, which was the design. The Sealhouse Vigil had drawn off every reader the diocese could field to stand watch over an empty press across town, so that the stone at the crossing was guarded by men who could swing a rod and not one who could pass a clause. Izel worked the door with her transit ledger, stamping entries, her satchel of notarized hides indistinguishable from the satchel that mattered. The widow's key had opened the sacristy at the 4th hour. The lectern hides lay dry in their drawer where the salt could not reach them, counted, ribboned, ready for a reading. Meta stood in the wards with a basin. The netmaker watched the seawall for nothing. Every thread he had spread thin to keep deniable was drawn now to 1 lectern and 1 hour, and the arithmetic did not forgive a second draw. Calder entered last, as principals do. He came up the center aisle with Seth walking ahead of him, the kiln man's sleeve already cut away at the shoulder, so the brand showed grey and seamed under the candles. Primary exhibit. Advertised. Aaron read the arm from 4 paces by reflex, the way a man counts steps on a stair he has fallen down before. Standard servitude. Perpetual. The same cold serif copied into 47 other arms, baskets deep behind the rail. Every one of them about to be read aloud and supplied and re-blessed into a permanence the doctrine called mercy. He kept his face the face of a clerk awaiting dictation. Inside the coat, against his ribs, the oilcloth held 2 sheets and the tarred twine bit where the knot had cinched too tight. The underdeacon called for the scribe of record. He stepped forward. The drawer slid. He drew the lectern height for the master grant in his right hand and the substitute in his left.
And the exchange happened in the half-second a man uses to square a sheet against a reading rail. One oiled hide laid down, its twin folded back into the sleeve. No theft, no theatre. Only a clerk fussing the document flat. The founding rubbing settled under the lamp carrying the hairline comma, no wider than a gull's quill laid down. And the footnote buried 3 references back, where any index walking finger would skate across it like meltwater on slate. The seam did not show. He pressed the top edge with his thumb. The hide lay quiet, the way a thing lies quiet when it intends to go off. Calder looked at him then, not with suspicion, worse, with the mild approval of a man watching a tool perform its single function. The look a notary gives a competent hand he will never bother to remember. "Read the register," Calder said. "Supply every article, withhold nothing."
The instruction was a gift, and Aaron took it without changing his breathing. Withhold nothing meant the deacon's right would pronounce the blessing article aloud over a grant drafted before that article was ever coined. Supply every article meant the condition phrased in the charter's own register, provided that such service be found lawful at the hour of its blessing, would be walked peg to peg until it demanded the very word the founding stone could not contain. The church had hired the hand. The church had bought the calendar. The church was about to stamp its own conclusion onto Aaron's edit and call the sound a seal. He set his finger to the first line and did not let it shake. One thing only stood unproved, and it stood on his tongue. A spoken reading was self-executing on the misreader. The Second Amendment, Seth's discharge, folded under the same footnote, never once read aloud by any throat that had lived, would arrive at the lectern in this hand or not at all, and the test and the verdict would land in the same instant on whoever carried it. He opened his mouth to read. "Stop." Calder's voice fell flat as a stamped seal, no louder than a man correcting a margin. Aaron's finger held the line. That mark. Calder did not point. He never pointed. Between the renewing and the Lord it renews for. A scrivener's hiccup, no more. Strike it and read on. The hand that cut the founding stone did not hiccup. Aaron kept his eyes on the grey serif, on the comma the width of a gull's quill laid flat. Diocesan usage, 3rd book. A graven mark stands until a superior grant unmakes it. Name me the superior grant. A pause, the length of a candle's guttering. Confirmation needs no superior grant. It restates what is. Then it restates the mark. He let the logic close like a drawer pushed home. Confirmation copies. It does not correct. Your own right forbids the reader to mend what he reads. The seal takes the reader's part. You learn that on a tanner's arm. The line landed. Calder's jaw worked once, the muscle at the hinge standing out like a knot under wet rope. And across the room, Izel's stamp went down on a transit hide, with the same dry click it had made for an hour. The network holding its breath in the shape of ordinary work. He had buried Garin. He had watched the seal side, with the page against the man who carried it. And he could not now stand at this lectern and argue the page had lied. The condition, then. Calder's finger came down at last, on the footnote 3 references back, dressed as boundary language, peg and seawall line, where any index-walking thumb skated past it like meltwater off slate. Read this aloud, and you supply a thing unsupplied, lawful at the hour of its blessing. Lawfulness is presumed. Canon presumes it the instant the deacon's hand lifts. Presumed or proved? Aaron turned the hide a quarter, so the lamp caught the register's spine. The grant walks it peg to peg in its own register. Lawful service requires lawful confirmation. Lawful confirmation requires the blessing article. The blessing article requires a word first coined at the Sexton's Council, year 40 of the present house. He let the date lie there a moment, cold. The stone was cut in year 9.
Then the article is read in over it. Calder's voice lowered the way a man lowers it to lift a heavier thing. Supply every article. My own instruction. Stamp it fresh, and the defect is cured. A cure presumes a body that can hold the medicine. Flat. You cannot stamp into year 9 a word minted in year 40. A grant holds nothing that postdates its cutting. Supply the article, and the grant reads incomplete against its own condition.
Withhold it, and the service was never lawfully blessed. The right arrives at one door or the other, Inquisitor, and both are bolted from the inside. The sea carries emergency power. The renewal cures what is void. The renewal renews. It does not raise the dead.
Aaron's thumb pressed the top edge of the hide, where it lay quiet, the way a thing lies quiet when it means to go off. A void grant is not cured, it is re-granted, and re-granting wants the original Lord's living hand. Your perpetual brand swears that hand is bound, not free to grant. You would need the master to act, and your doctrine has spent the master into a fixture. Cite me the canon that lets a fixture sign. He had none. Aaron watched him hunt for it. Intent governs, Calder said. The drafters meant perpetual service. Intent reads through the dead letter. Your pulpit preaches the letter is not dead. Aaron almost spent a smile and kept it in the ledger. Immutable, self-executing.
8 months you have told 3 dioceses the brand cannot be construed, only obeyed. Construe it now for intent, and you unsay every sermon that raised your hunt. I will hold you to your own doctrine. It is the only honest instrument in this room. Silence sat down between them. A herring gull cried once beyond the high window, working the vigil's leavings, wholly indifferent to which way the law fell. Meta's basin caught a drip from the sacristy roof, one bead, then another, counting. Calder read the hide a long moment, reading it the way Aaron read arms, line by line, weight by weight. And Aaron marked the exact instant the man ran out of cannon, the small settling at the shoulders of an auditor who has worked every column twice and found the sum standing against him. No precedent left, no definition unturned. He had something older than precedent. Calder's eyes did not leave the page. His hand rose, 2 fingers, unhurried, to the rod-bearer at the wall. The rod left the wall. Aaron kept his eyes on Calder's raised fingers. 2 of them. The gesture stalled at the top of its arc, like a clause held open by a comma it cannot resolve. And he spoke into the stall, because the stall was the only floor left under him. Bring it down on the scribe of record, he said. Midright, stone unsealed. And you finish the renewal with a body on the lectern step, and no second hand in 3 dioceses drilled to close what you opened. A beat. Then account for the silence to your see. The rod-bearer checked half a stride. Knuckles wrapped in Tanner's cord against the recoil. He looked to Calder for the word that turns a raised hand into an order. Strike him, Calder said. The right outlives its scribe. The right, yes. The footnote, no. Aaron set his palm flat on the hide, over the place the press would land. You preach the ratified clause immutable, self-executing, not to be construed, only obeyed. You carried that down a Tanner's arm and called the burning lawful. Hear yourself. The instant this press falls, my footnote is ratified, and by your doctrine, immutable. You may not strike what the stone confirms, for the reader cannot mend what he reads. To cut my word out, you must construe the stone, and 8 months you have taught 3 dioceses that the stone cannot be construed. Flat. You bricked your own exit. I only walked you to it. Calder understood. Aaron watched it arrive, the man's hand twitching now not toward the rod, but toward the press itself, to stay it. The danger no longer Aaron's mouth, but the descent of the seal. Hold the press, Calder said. The right, which Aaron had built to fall on its own weight,
like every machine he had ever drafted up from its first lawful part, hung. That was when Seth spoke. He spoke from the deacon's grip beside the font, voice cracked from a day of being a thing held rather than a man. And the words were not common speech. Older, the vowels long. A formula cut before the present house numbered its years. By the first mark on this arm, I claim the rider beneath the rest. He had not fought, he had argued. The oldest brand on his forearm, buried under 3 later grants, the way a seawall hides under silt, carried a self-manumission rider from a law the church had let lapse without ever repealing, and an unadjudicated manumission claim by the right's own order of precedence halts every other act until it is ruled. The press could not fall. It also could not stay. Calder's hand froze between 2 duties his own canon ranked against him. The rider was self-executing too. Speaking it before its blessed hour tripped the seal's penalty, the same fire that had read Garin down to the article he lacked, and the old brand began to heat, the skin going the wet red of a kettle's first complaint. He had spent his leverage. A hostage is worth the breath in him. Seth had just signed that breath over to buy seconds, and he stood there burning to make a clock. Aaron did not waste the seconds thanking him. He drove the press down. He put his whole weight behind it, both palms, the way you close a ledger on a finger you mean to keep. And the stone took the hide and the comma and the footnote 3 references back and the second footnote folded under that. Seth's discharge written into the same act as Aaron's edit. 2 manumissions sealed on one fall. The press met the stone. No thunderclap. A dry click. The same the stamp had made all hour. The network's heartbeat. Ordinary work finishing. The heat left Seth's arm between one breath and the next.
The penalty had reached for an unlawful claim and found, at the instant of its reaching, a lawful discharge already sealed beneath it. Nothing left to burn. Calder lowered his fingers. He read the stone the way Aaron read arms, line by weight, and his shoulders made the small settling of an auditor whose every column now sums against him. Aaron looked at Seth's forearm, at the old rider cooling to scar, and saw the shape of the thing at last. The man had known. Under 3 grants and a decade of obedience, he had carried his own free hand the whole time, a key swallowed and kept, and had chosen this flaw, this right, this single breath to spend a freedom he could have spent any quiet night alone, so that it bought the whole room instead. The bell had not rung yet. It hung in the founding tower above them, a bronze the diameter of a cartwheel, and the vigil keeper stood with the rope slack in his fist because no one had given him leave to pull it.
Renewal struck at the same mark each year. The keeper waited on the water clock, not on the men below, and the float dropped its last barley corn of measured time, while Aaron kept both palms on the sealed hide, as though the stone might yet reconsider. It did not reconsider. Stone is poor at that. The bell came down on its own weight, one stroke, and the sound went out across the province the way a writ goes out, slow, total, indifferent to whether anyone wished to receive it. Aaron heard it in the floor first, then in his teeth. What followed he could not see, only reconstruct, the way he had learned to reconstruct a man's whole servitude from the broken serif on one wrist, across 3 dioceses, in kiln yards and grain lofts, and the back rooms where notaries kept their irons warm. The blessing article his footnote demanded sounded in the master grant, and every brand drafted to stand on that article without supplying it failed its own test of validity, and the marks did not vanish so much as demote, chains converting, line by line, into mere registry ink, a record of who a person had been rather than a leash on who they were. He learned the shape of it from the doorway. A girl ran in from the porch, no older than Wren, sleeve pushed to the elbow, and held her forearm up into the lamplight not in pain, but in demand, the way you show a clerk a figure you want checked. The brand was still there. It had gone the flat brown of an old stamp on a receipt. Present, dated, toothless. "It doesn't pull," she said.
She said it twice, testing the sentence for fraud. It doesn't pull anymore. Seth sat against the font, with his cooled arm cradled in his lap, and did not look at his own scar. He looked at the girls, auditing the result. Outside the sound built, not cheering, not yet, a low collective exhale. Hundreds of people in the dark, discovering simultaneously that a weight they had carried so long they had stopped naming it, had been set down by a hand they would never meet. Aaron knew the arithmetic of it, and refused to round it up into something warm. Some marks had faded, some had merely converted. A registry mark is still a name in a book a hostile clerk can read. He lifted his palms off the hide. The print of his hand stayed a moment in the sweat, then went. "You've unmade nothing." Calder's voice had recovered its level. He stood where the press had pinned his cannon against him, and he spoke without heat, which was worse than heat, the way a creditor's silence is worse than his shouting. "You construed one stone. There are 900 parishes that never heard this right, and a see that will hear of it by Thursday, and an archive that can issue a corrected exemplar over a synod seal and call your founding stone the forgery." He gathered his torn sleeve into his fist. "I cannot strike the footnote. Granted, I can ratify 1,000 new grants clean of the seam you crawled through, and teach every novice to draft against you by name. You made law tonight. I will make more of it, and faster. And I have the irons." "I know," Aaron said. It was not concession. It was a man reading a balance sheet aloud so no one mistook it for a victory. He had won the instrument. He held that the way he held everything, provisionally, pending appeal. The amendment was ratified, and by Calder's own preached doctrine, immutable, that protected the words on the stone and nothing else. It did not protect the girl in the doorway from a notary who would simply rebrand her tomorrow under a grant drafted around his comma. It did not protect Seth, who had spent his once swallowed key here and now had a scar where his exit used to be. It did not protect the clinic, the coalition, Meta's slack ledger, or the 4 already freed, every one of them now a name in a record, that an institution with 900 parishes and a standing grievance could open at leisure. Wren pushed through the crowd to him, the original rubbing still rolled in her hand, and asked the only question that mattered. "Is it done?" He looked at the bronze still humming in its tower, at Calder, counting his remaining irons behind his eyes, at the province, exhaling in a dark that would have to be lit and held and defended parish by parish before any of it was safe. "The law is done," he said. "Now we have to survive being right." Dawn came in grey and uninvited. The vigil candles had guttered to stubs in their own wax, and the people who filled the nave through the night stood now in the churchyard, not knowing whether they were permitted to go home, because no clause anyone had ever drafted told a freed man what he did at sunrise. Aaron watched them through the open door. They waited at the gate the way cattle wait once it has been opened and no one has spoken. He logged it as the first liability and went looking for the rest. Yesterday, he had been an entry in a book. This morning, he was the man the entries answered to, which carried more exposure, not less. Calder withdrew at first light, with the deliberateness of someone leaving a deposition he intends to reopen. He took his irons. He took, more usefully, the names. Every parish, notary, and grain loft, now in default of the old grant, catalogued behind his level eyes, and he would carry that catalogue to a see that issued corrected exemplars, the way other men issued change for a coin. "Tuesday," he said at the threshold, fitting the word to Aaron like a hearing date. Then the door, the cold sweep of harbour air, and a single herring gull screaming over the emptied square as though it, too, wished its objection on the record.
Aaron did the arithmetic standing up. The church had never needed the rod for the work that mattered. It had the salt.
It blessed the salt that cured the herring, that paid the rents, that carried this coast through every winter. And it could withhold that blessing parish by parish, declaring the catch unclean, the trade lapsed, the buyers across the strait forbidden to touch a freed heretic's barrels. It could refuse to marry them, refuse to bury them, and strike 900 parishes from the only roads their grain ever moved on. Excommunication was not a thunderbolt. It was an embargo with incense. Free then, and uninsurable, he had drafted men out of bondage one wrist at a time, reading each brand like a covenant written to be broken. He had never once drafted the thing that came after, the dull machinery by which a person who owned himself stayed fed, counted, and defended against the institution that wanted him back on its books. That machinery did not exist. He would have to build it the way the girl's brand had been built, from nothing, with the tools to hand, before the ink set wrong. The crowd had not dispersed. They turned toward the doorway when his shadow crossed it, 200 faces lifting at once, and he understood that the silence was not gratitude, but a question with no precedent. Now what? He had freed them, and thereby made himself responsible for the morning. The duty arrived without ceremony, the way a debt transfers when a creditor dies. You do not consent to it, you simply hold it next. He turned back inside and started naming what he had. Meta's ledger, slack for months now, was already a register that recognized no master. Widen it, and it became a roll of the self-owning, a book the diocese had not written and could not amend. Holt's seal house, emptied last night as a decoy, held a working press, a strong-box, and a chimney that drew. The widow's sacristy key opened more drawers than the one. Iselle could carry a satchel through any checkpoint because no guard searched a woman delivering altar linen.
The netmaker had tar, twine, and 40 men who mended in one shed and could be told a thing once. A coalition assembled to break a single bell could be repapered, clause by clause, into something that governed. He tried the word on himself and tested it for fraud the way the girl had tested hers. Founder. It did not pull either. That unsettled him more than if it had. "You're drafting again," Wren said. She had not slept. The rubbing was still in her fist, gone soft as cloth at the folds. "Your mouth moves." "We need a second stone," he said. "Not this one. This one is canon. It guards words. We need one that guards bread." He drew the oilcloth packet from his coat, the netmaker's tarred twine still knotting it shut, and weighed it in his palm. 2 amendments that had emancipated a province and could not purchase it 1 sack of unblessed flour. Last night bought the right to exist. That's the first filing. It earns a hearing. It does not earn a harbor.
Seth rose from the font, cradling the cool dam.
"So name the second filing." "All of it." He set the packet on the lectern, where the genuine hide had lain 12 hours before, squaring its edges from habit, and looked past the door to the boats and the padlocked salt houses. Records they can't seize, grain they can't bless or curse, a roll of names kept where their writ won't run. We stop construing chains and start building what the chains were holding shut. He worked the knot loose with 1 fingernail. They answer Tuesday. We open at noon. He set a clean hide on the lectern. Not a brand, a blank, scraped pale. The nap still rough where the lime had not finished biting. He squared the gull's quill, cut its nib against his thumbnail, and laid down the first line of an instrument that bound no one to a master, and therefore, by every canon drummed into this stolen body, could not exist, be it covenanted between equals. The oak gall ink dried brown as old blood. He read it back. It held. Every deed he had drafted ran one direction, lord to chattel, a river with a single bank. And this one needed 2 banks, 2 hands, 2 signatures each of which could be withdrawn. And the grammar for that did not live in the diocesan formulary. So he built it from the only model on the coast that already ran both ways, the fisher's lay, where the net maker took a share and the crew took a share, and a bad season fell on every share alike. Reciprocity. He had been writing it on wrists for weeks without the word for it. Mutual covenant, Wren said, reading upside down, a trick she had lifted off him. You're giving them the right to leave you, too. A bond a man can't quit is the thing we spent a province to break. He did not look up. I am not drafting a kinder caller. Then the guild.
He charted the clinic where it stood. Holt's emptied seal house, the press still warm under his palm, the chimney drawing a thin gray thread over the salt roofs, and wrote it into being as a company of scribes of record. Dues in grain, apprenticeship in reading, a quorum no single hand could override, and no single death could end. The diocese had taught reading to 40 men in 900 parishes. He would teach it to 100 by Lammas. A thing the church kept scarce on purpose became, in 3 clauses, a trade you could be examined into. "You're making more of yourself," Seth said. He cradled the cooled arm still, but his eyes worked the page. "On purpose." "One scribe is a heretic. A guild is an institution." He flattened a fresh sheet. "They burned the first. They sue the second." The standard form took longest, because it had to be stupid-proof, copyable by a tanner's apprentice who had owned a knife of letters for a week. Blank for the name. Blank for the brand's opening words. The construing clause beneath, plain as a recipe. And then the article the others would never have thought to add. A recital that the bearer had always been free, and the prior grant merely void, so that nothing on the sheet read as a gift the church had given, and could therefore take back. A freedom granted can be revoked, a freedom recognized cannot. Calder rides Tuesday with his corrected exemplar, Iselle said from the door. Altar linen still folded over one arm, the boxwood net float swinging from her satchel cord. Let him. Aaron dipped and wrote the failsafe into the binding margin of the master roll, where no copyist would think to look, because nothing important ever sat in a margin. Any future emendation, however sealed, took effect only as a new grant, and a new grant wanted the living hand of the granting Lord. Doctrine had spent the masters into fixtures, stone, furniture, things that could not sign. He had now made fixtures of their heirs as well. Every renewal they swung would land on that clause and stop, the way a chisel stops on a knot. He wrote it twice, in 2 registers, kept apart. Bolt the door, then hide the second bolt. He counted what the page had become, and found he could not name it with any word the diocese would lend him. A covenant of equals, a guild that taught the forbidden skill, a roll the writ could not reach, fed by grain the salt blessing could not touch. Not a clinic any more, a polity, drafted standing up on a dead lord's lectern. He needed a seal. The sea answered to a matrix of cast bronze, the founding stone's device worn into every wax that mattered on this coast. He had no bronze, so he took the boxwood float off Iselle's cord, stood it on the strongbox, and cut into the wet-smelling end grain with the penknife. Not the stone, not the cross, but a plain set of scales with one pan struck empty. He warmed green wax at the tallow flame. 3 drops fell on the foot of the covenant. He pressed, and the boxwood bit. And when he lifted it, the scales stood in the wax, crude, legible, answering to no sea between here and the strait. "Sign," he said, and turned the quill around. Meta took it the way you take a hot coal. She had held a pen 10,000 times for other men's accounts, and never once as a party to anything. Her mark came slow, an M with a tail like a fishhook. He signed beneath it, and the name his hand wrote was the one no brand on this coast had ever recorded. Aaron Vey, witness, founder. The wax cooled, the scales held. Seth had stopped cradling the arm. That was the first entry Aaron logged.
the way you note a missing signature before reading the clause it was meant to close. The old man had set the cooled limb across his own knee and left his hand open beside it, palm up, fingers slack. A man who had carried something a long way and quietly decided to put it on the floor. The lectern's seal had fired on him and found his discharge underneath, lawful, and so it had not killed him outright. It had only billed him. Aaron understood the distinction now. A penalty that cannot seize the principal seizes the interest, and the interest was Seth, a grey creeping from the lips inward, each breath shorter than the last by some increment a patient man could nearly measure. "Sit," Aaron said, and did not pretend it was for comfort. He wanted the witness still while he read him. Seth sat. The boxwood seal threw its small green shadow across the covenant's foot. A herring gull worked the salt roofs outside, complaining at nothing, while the chimney drew its thin thread of grey over Holt's emptied yard, as if the day were ordinary. "You read the brand," Seth said. "I read the years." The words came spaced, like coins counted one at a time onto a counter. "That raider was 60 years lapsed when I spoke it. I was the last mouth that had heard it said lawful." A pause to spend a breath he could not spare. "When I stop, the law I carry stops with me, unless you take it down first." Aaron pulled a fresh sheet. He said nothing consoling, because there was nothing consoling the man would respect, and dictation was a thing they both understood as work. "Slowly," he said. "Forms first." So the old man emptied himself into the record. The cadence of the lapsed rider, its trigger words, the counsel that killed it, and the year, the three exceptions a clever deacon might raise, and the answer to each. Aaron wrote in 2 registers and kept them apart, the way he kept the master roll's fail-safe apart. Because a thing said once by a dying man and copied wrong was worse than a thing never said. He read each line back. Seth corrected him twice, a tense, a numeral, and the correcting cost him more than the speaking. When the law was on the page, the old man went quieter, lighter, the way a debtor is lighter at the counting-house door with the note paid. "Now the part you won't like," Seth said. "I have a guild for the parts I don't like." A sound came out of him that might have been a laugh in a younger chest. "3 dioceses," he said. "You freed 3. You walked out of that vigil thinking in coastlines." His open hand turned just enough to point past the wall, past the straight, past everything the boxwood scales answered to. "The salt road runs 400 leagues. There are brands inland that have never seen the sea, on arms that have never heard the word recognized. You taught 40 men to read what the diocese kept blind. Teach 4,000. A breath. Examine them, roll them, send them up the rivers with blank forms and a clean knife. You are not the cure, boy. You are the first copy." Aaron set the quill down across the inkwell, square. "The first copy is the dangerous one. Everything after is just print." "Then print." Seth's eyes have begun the slow work of releasing the middle distance. "I held a law 60 years in one skull, and it nearly died with me tonight. Don't build a thing that lives in one skull. Build the thing that lives in the roll." That was the bequest. Aaron heard it as such, weighed it, accepted delivery. He took the old man's open hand and closed it, not for tenderness, he told himself, but because a document should not be left unsigned and gaping. The fingertips had gone cool already, the chill of the freed arm spread now through the man who had spent himself to fire its discharge. Seth's breath ran to that shortened, ledgered count. Aaron watched it the way he watched a press come down, attentive, helpless, exact. "Sign the roll," he said, and fitted the quill into the closed hand and steered it, because the man had spoken himself free hours ago and had never once been recorded as a party to anything. The mark Seth made was not a name. It was a single short stroke,
the beginning of a letter the hand could not finish, trailing off the line into the margin where the second bolt lay hidden. Then the count reached its last entry and stopped. Aaron read the time off the chimney's shadow and noted it, and found that the only witness on this coast who could have witnessed him was the one whose hand he was holding shut. 11 days brought it back. The writ came by sea, not river, which told Aaron how the church now weighed him. Rivers were for tithes and pardons, but a galley flying the white and the broken key was an instrument served on equals, and they had never served an equal on this coast before. He read it on the key before the wax had fully chilled. The seal was correct. The Latin was not. 2 ablatives where the form demanded genitives, the haste of a clerk writing under a bishop's breath. And he filed the error the way a man pockets a coin found in a gutter, small, but his.
A writ of war is a document like any other. It names parties, recites grievance, declares the term. This one named him by trade and not by name, the scribe of Holt, the breaker of brands. And Aaron noted the omission as a tactic. To name a man is to admit he is a man. They preferred him a verb. The inquisitor came down the gangplank without escort, which was itself a sentence Aaron passed before the boots touched stone. Brask was thin in the way of a man who had decided early that flesh was overhead. No chains on him, no irons, only a satchel of unmarked leather and a reader's stoop. He did not look at the free dockhands, rolling barrels with their sleeves up and their scars showing to the gulls. He looked at the ledgers stacked under the awning, the 40 clerks copying at their boards, the boxwood scales turning slow on their pivot, and something passed over his dry face that Aaron recognized because he had worn it himself across 100 counting-house thresholds. Appraisal.
"You kept the apparatus," Brask said, by way of greeting. His voice was a tax assessor's, flat and itemizing. "I expected ash. Rebellions burn the registry first. They hate the proof of what they were." He set the satchel down on a crate of dried cod and did not flinch at the smell. "You hoard it. Interesting." "Burning the registry would be confession," Aaron said. "I prefer the record stand. It acquits me line by line. It indicts you the same way." Brask's thumb found the writ in Aaron's hand, traced the broken seal without taking it. "You understand what this is. A claim, unliquidated. The damages are asserted, not proved." Aaron folded it once. Along the crease the clerk had already weakened. "You've come to prove them." "I've come to read your defenses and price them." He said it the way another man would say good morning. A herring gull dropped to the cod crate, considered the satchel, and Brask let it stand there a beat too long before a flick of 2 fingers sent it screaming off the salt roofs. 3 dioceses unbranded in a season. The deacons say witchcraft. The bishops say sedition. I say neither. I read your method on the voyage in. He tapped the satchel. You found a flaw in the covenant, and you taught it. That is not magic, and it is not war. It is litigation conducted with a knife. You've described my whole profession. The thin mouth moved, not a smile. The muscle for it had atrophied, but the place where a smile would go. Then we are colleagues, Brask said, and I have come to overrule you. Aaron weighed the man, as he had weighed Seth in his last hours, reading the body for the law it carried, the ink-stained second knuckle, the eyes that ticked left to right even at rest, the satchel of unmarked leather that held, he was now certain, not warrants, but books. Brask had not come with soldiers because Brask did not believe in soldiers. He believed in the same thing Aaron believed in, a better drafted clause. That was the whole of the threat, and it was sufficient. You'll want quarters, Aaron said. There's an inn that won't poison you, and a clerk who'll copy you any public role you ask for, since you'll ask anyway. Generous. Procedural. I'd rather you read the true record than imagine a worse one. He turned the writ over, found the clerk's 2 bad ablatives,
and pressed his thumbnail under them, as if a footnote could be inserted on the spot. "Your masters drafted this in a hurry. That's the only thing in it that frightens me. A hurried opponent makes errors I can exploit, and errors I can't predict." Brask retrieved his satchel, and the weight of it settled his stoop another degree. 11 days you spent buying back what they took. I read that on the voyage, too. He started up the quay toward the town.
I intend to make the next purchase cost you everything you have.
Aaron watched him go and did not answer, because the answer was already on the boards behind him, 40 hands deep and copying. He looked past the strait. One coastline clean, 400 leagues of branded arms inland, rivers running up into a continent that had never heard the word recognized spoken lawful. And on the master roll, beneath Seth's unfinished stroke, a blank line, waiting, and his hand already moving to fill it.